All right, so thankfully we were able to use James's model, and of course we're going to introduce Photoshop today, but however I am the substitute, Christopher Rhett, at San Antonio College, and well, it doesn't make sense to kind of just teach Photoshop in a vacuum, right? I mean, like, here's a line, here's how you select nothing, right? So don't get me wrong, you may or may not actually use this assignment per se. Like, you might not actually end up doing an elevation or a section, but I can almost guarantee that Tunks is going to have you do some sort of perspective and start to do some of these things actually in those views. So one thing you guys at least pointed out, that you didn't know how to necessarily get Make 2D lines from Rhino to Photoshop. To be honest, I don't even do it that way. I definitely always appreciate the line weights of my drawings. That's the way I was taught by Escamilla and all of the other architecture professors before me. So it makes a lot of sense to still incorporate that and actually, in my case, treat Photoshop more as a tool to fill in the blanks of more or less like a coloring book. But I need to make the coloring book and I need to make the lines and keep them tight, right? So one thing that I could say for today is I could develop a perspective, right? I could turn on my camera, show, and of course really dial in a camera situation. In my case, whoa, what do you got going on here? Oh, there it is. So we got our camera, and of course we can actually move those things and really dial in an exact perspective. I could also, of course, still rotate some things. I could take an item, center myself to it, and really focus in, right? Obviously, maybe that's my perspective. It's not the greatest perspective in the world, but again, I could dial it in as well, right? So taking my points, and again, just in case you needed a recap of, get out of here. Oh my gosh. There you go. Sweet. Obviously, I don't want my stationary point inside of a building, but let's say that was my view, and you guys know how to save views, right? Good. Named views. We don't necessarily have to save it today, but, for the sake of being, I could, of course, select all. If I had it available. I guess it's not on there. That's okay. It's a new version of Rhino, but that's all right. Of course, make 2D from this view, and maintain source layers, and press apply. In my case, it should make basically something on the top view, so I'll go to my top view. Sweet. And take that position. Now, yeah, there's some definitely good make 2D there. Not too bad. So maybe there's a perspective for today. I can go over a few things for perspective. And definitely want to show you clipping plane, just in case you need a recap on that one. And turn off my camera real quick. And of course, hide it. Now, my screen probably looks a little bit different. I'm sure Tunks probably works in Windows, and to be honest, this program is the exact same commands or tools, but sometimes they're in a different location. So again, another reason to record it. That way you can pause the video and find what I'm clicking on. However, you can also type in clipping plane, right, just in case you don't know, and essentially establish a plane. So in my case, doesn't matter where, but you'll see eventually some sort of section, right? Almost like a section line. And of course, when you move that with Gumball, you'll see that it actually treats the entire place like a section. So potentially we can make a floor plan diagram very easily, right? Obviously, I'd cut it like this for my floor plan and make 2D. Well, what if I want a section? Rotate it. And in lifetime, I have a section, right? Or elevation, or what have you, right? So again, I don't know if I, stepped on anything, but again, hopefully it's just an easy to use tool.
What did you say that name was called?
Clipping plane. Definitely want to write that one down. You can actually use multiple at a time. So if you wanted to do a double section with perspective, which is, don't get me wrong, maybe you don't use that till design 4, but it can definitely be useful, especially if I'm trying to make a section. So I'd take that piece and of course align to it, and of course make 2D. In my case, I'd probably want to stick to the cardinal directions. Oop. And obviously use my views, right? So in my case, I'd probably stick to an actual view like left or right and make sure that it was a perfectly orthogonal view before I went and, flipped it. Anyway, but that's looking pretty cool for today, at least something that I can Photoshop. Again, I'm kind of just doing this for the sake of tutorial and so that we have something to actually teach Photoshop on. So in my case, I'm just going to get a quick shot, make 2D, and apply. Sweet. So we got 2 things to look at and 2 things to maybe put on the board. I typically like an 11 by 17 ratio, so very often I'll do a 17 inches by 11 inches. Ends up being usually a tiny square if we're making things 1-to-1, but if I hold shift, of course I can make some things proportional, right, in my case. But again, you can't really scale perspective, right? I mean, there's no, everything's going to shrink towards the back or get bigger towards the foreground. So again, often scale is not applied to a perspective. However, in our case with this elevation, maybe that is to scale. I don't necessarily want to go over that. Does he do viewports with you guys at all? Like how to scale the viewport or paper space? Those kind, I don't want to confuse anybody. To be fair, a lot of people do different things for Rhino. I mean, and that's totally fine. I'll keep it easy today, right? Obviously, I'll just use this kind of as my bounding box to represent the paper space. And we'll make a copy. Because why not? That's looking pretty good. It's kind of taking up the frame a little bit, so again, to keep things proportional, that looks more or less a little bit better. However, from here, you'll still do the exact same things you do, taking this into Illustrator via DWG or Adobe Illustrator file. You'll still scale things if you'd like to have them be on the piece of paper. So, I mean, nothing really changes there. So, I mean, again, arguably some of us do that a little bit differently, but in my case, I go to Export Selected. I use the tried and true method of the DWG. And in my case for today, we'll say test, make 2D. Bless you.
Thank you.
We'll put it on the desktop so it's easy to find. And we'll make sure that it's 2007 lines. We'll export and call it a day, at least for Rhino.
Does it have to be 2007 lines?
Doesn't have to be, it just seems to work the best. Also, Cam Imperial works fine too. To be fair, honestly, everything works there except the, like, don't choose poly surfaces if you're exporting lines, and, well, don't choose lines if you're exporting poly surfaces. From there, we'll go ahead and open it up. Now, just to kind of show you what that does in Photoshop, because it will open up a DWG, but notice something, right? So if you go to File, Open, I don't know if you can actually open directly a DWG. Actually, I'm interested to find out myself. And one thing I would say is, like, never feel afraid to, like, test something, right? I mean, if it's grayed out, it's grayed out. No big deal. It's not going to open it up. And all readable formats, or, you know, obviously all documents. Let's see if I can import it, though. So, for instance, a new file, 11 by 17, create. Wrong direction, but that's okay. We can change it. And I just kind of want to see if I can actually import, right, a DWG. In my case, ooh, yeah, no options there. What about placing a linked image or file? Well, let's try that one. Desktop. Oh, doesn't look like a DWG really works, right? And to be fair, neither does an Adobe Illustrator file. So one thing that I often like to do is, well, I want to open it up in Illustrator anyway, because again, I want to change the line weight, and I possibly want to change the colors, or even add shade and shadow, or again, other elements that I may have already been working on in the first place, right? I mean, half the time we're working on a diagram and then professor goes, hey, I want to see a perspective of this. Well, shoot, I've already got that view, right? I've already worked on it. I've already got some line weight for it, and I've already got some scale figures. I've already got context. So again, I like to use these as what we call a workflow, and I'm sure Professor Tunks has called it that himself. We use a workflow in architecture of many different programs, and it's definitely not uncommon that you use 5, 6, 8 programs for a single project, right? I mean, it depends what program is that it's best at. In my case, it is personally my theory that one day, in your time, my time, possibly like 15 years from now, there'll just be one program, and it'll be called Architecture 1 or something. To be fair, before Revit, it was AutoCAD. Before AutoCAD, it was Form Z. Before Form Z, it was a drafting table. So what I'm trying to say is it will change, right? But you'll be expected as an architect to at least try, right? Or hire somebody who does know the programs, like Escamilla, right? Anyway, in our case, I'll go ahead and open up that DWG, and it does accept DWGs fairly well. If I go ahead and do so, I'm going to scale to fit artboard. And there it is. Obviously, I don't have to have it to any scale, but if I needed to, I would scale it to this 11 by 17. I don't know if Professor Tunks goes over how he battles scale, but obviously there's many different ways to do scale. You can do it by the viewport itself. You could do it by measuring something. You could simply shrink it down to the actual size. I mean, there's definitely a few ways to do it. But again, want to talk about mostly Photoshop today. So let's get some lines, like I said, almost like a coloring book for Photoshop. In my case, I think I'm going to go with actually both today. I mean, why not? We can do actually several different things to show you in Photoshop. I don't want to overwhelm you, but at the same time, I do want to treat it as if it could be something potentially helpful in Studio. So I don't know, maybe I'm composing my sheet. I'm trying to give off some sort of idea for a major project. So from here, I'd maybe want to scale things. I want to make sure I have things in the right spot or the right line weight. I specifically say this because once I get into Photoshop, I really can't manipulate these lines. I can't just change a line. I mean, I could erase it. And as you'll see, I'll go over a couple of things that you can do. But you'd want to guide this. And hopefully, Professor Tunks has taught you about the invisible box, right? You can click on the layer. Good, because that's a trade secret of a lot of us. Not even the graphic designers sometimes know that. I'm like, really? The architect major had to teach you? Anyway. But in our case, maybe I'd want to change that line weight, change its thickness. And again, as you guys know, way easier by just selecting the entire layer. And doing that one at a time. Obviously, fake it until I make it. Maybe we get some gray in there. Obviously, I'm just doing this for looks, right? That way we have something for. I'm not exactly trying to go by a standard or anything like that. Don't copy my numbers, is what I'm saying, right? I'm just kind of doing that for the sake of time, and so we're not here for 2 hours. But let's say that was my line weight, grotesque line weight. Not gonna lie, the roofs are way too thick, but that's okay, right? That's looking pretty good. How do I get it into Photoshop? Well, 2 ways. Bless you. I could just drag it into Photoshop as a smart object, which is essentially how it'll come in. So if I select everything, right, in my case, select it all, and quite literally drag it, so you do have to select the object itself, and make sure you select something. You can quite literally drag it into Photoshop, drop it, and it comes in as a object, right? Really not much to it. But again, kind of a step-by-step, and as you see, we can't just open up that DWG directly in this shop. Sorry, what was it?
Can you drag it back? Like,
ooh, you know, that's a good question. I don't know.
like if you're working on something, you're like, oh.
I don't think so.
Oh.
But to be honest with you, I've never tried. At least with these separated lines. Now, notice the way that it came in Photoshop. It's completely connected now. And that is how it will stay, right? It's no longer actually lines. So one thing that I like to express between these two programs that may have been already said is that Illustrator is a vector program. Does anybody know what that is?
Fine lines.
It's line work, right? It's essentially code. So everything that you're looking at in Illustrator, what you're looking at is actually code being revisualized into lines, points, shapes, and other objects, right? You may have noticed if you've ever zoomed in to Illustrator, it never gets pixelated. You guys notice that? Ever. Ever, right? It is not pixelated. In fact, there'd be no reason to, because actually every time I zoom in, the calculator is recalculating that line, right? However, take a look at what was generated in Photoshop. It is known as a raster program. Fair enough. Adobe actually only invented Photoshop. They purchased Illustrator, they purchased InDesign, they purchased Firefly, they purchased all these other things because they're a multi-billion-dollar company. And why would you work harder when you can just buy other people's great work? But in our case, when it comes in, it does come in as a standalone image. I'm going to call it that for now, but it's not really an image, but it has been turned into something else. You'll notice that if you zoom in into it, oh, different, huh? Arguably different, right? And unfortunately, when you print this out, technically it is there. If you were to get a magnifying glass, you'd notice that, oh man, I could tell that this person printed it in Photoshop and not Illustrator. Some of you guys still wonder how your professors know. They're looking for the pixelation. And it goes without saying that, well, in Photoshop, you're always going to get pixelation. So keep that in mind. If I'm trying to have detailed line work, am I going to do that in Photoshop? But I might edit my image and then put it inside of my layer in Illustrator, especially if the line work was really important. I'd want to go back to Illustrator and make sure that I've actually placed some color underneath this if the line weight was absolutely imperative. However, there is a secret. Just increase the DPI to a point of which the eye cannot see, right? In our case, again, let's start from the beginning, however, because that is entirely useful, just dragging this in. But how does Photoshop work? Well, arguably, it's extremely confusing. Why? Because it looks just like every other Adobe program. And that can be quite confusing, right? The way that you can tell the subtle differences, well, on the Mac it says Photoshop, not Illustrator. But you'll actually notice different tools. And that's kind of the dead giveaway, right from the get-go, right? In my case, a couple of things, and yeah, I did do this a little wrong on purpose so I could show you how to fix some stuff. Again, let's explain the user interface. Now, keep in mind this is a Mac, and it might be slightly in different places. Oh, yeah. Well, not quite. Let's see. That's better. And arguably, I'll kind of have the confusion right there, right? But I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally clicked on both, and I was like, man, why isn't this working? Oh, wait, I'm trying to do Illustrator things in Photoshop. I'm trying to do Photoshop things in Illustrator. So it is one of those things that you kind of have to start practicing. It's like a harpsichord and a piano. Yeah, they look the same, but dang, do they sound different, and do they play differently? And of course, for different pieces of music. In our case, though, just to explain some Photoshop without, oh man, as soon as I move it, it gets big. Dang it, Mac, stop trying to help me. Okay, anyway, hopefully you can see it there. Not too bad. Keep in mind that in the recording, it will have the whole piece, right? But that being the case, just to explain the user interface, I don't know if it's been explained to you, but there's different presets in every Adobe program. You'll notice them actually in the top right corner. There's a weird kind of slightly shifted box, and if we click on it, you'll notice there's a couple of different presets. In my case, I've always used Essentials or Essentials Classic. I'm sure that's been said, at least for Illustrator. But the same thing happens in Photoshop, but unfortunately there isn't a Classic, even though Photoshop's older. What gives? I don't know. But clearly these departments maybe don't even talk to each other. But in our case, just to explain it, obviously we have the Move tool, some Selection tool, Lasso tool, Magic Wand tool, Crop tool, Rectangle tool, and to be honest, if you just float around long enough, it even gives you a preview, dang right, a video. Man, I would have killed for that 15 years ago learning this program. But it really is trying to help you out, right? Don't get me wrong, it's not going to be quite architectural, but hopefully you can start to see how these could be applied, at least in an architectural situation. But in our case, yeah, we don't deal with hummingbirds and coloring them too often, right? But as you can see, continuing, we have an eyedropper tool, which I'll go over some of these today. Again, we don't use every single tool, and you may have noticed that so far. In Rhino, why didn't we go over every tool? Well, we don't use every single tool of these programs, and at least not in the first class of computer graphics, right? Don't want to scare you away from the computer. But interesting enough, we noticed that we have our lines, and we noticed that there was actually some pixelation. Another thing that we notice is, well, we have tabs, and it works just like Illustrator does, right? So there's actually a lot of similarities. Again, so similar that arguably they look the exact same sometimes, especially if you start putting your layers in the same spot, and again, I digress. But again, some familiar things. We have our layers, we have our visibility, we have the ability to lock it, we have the ability to move it, all kinds of things. It's pretty intuitive of a program. You used to have to actually click something. Photoshop has come a long way since 2004 when I learned it, right? So And when I learned it, and when I learned all these programs, was by myself. Honestly, at a stage where I thought I wasn't going to make it. And to be fair, most institutions, they don't even go over this. They'll hand you the paper. Here's the assignment. We'll talk about it in 2 weeks. Good luck. And they'll have a TA or a teacher's assistant maybe answering some questions. So you will have to teach yourself in college. I know it kind of goes without saying. It's kind of a hard thing to hear. Like, wait a minute, I thought we were paying for knowledge. Well, you are, but just really the resource, right? However, in order to combat that, I like to record and really give you a hands-on situation of what's going on. But like I said, there's not much here, and thank goodness there's some lines here, because now we can do something with them. Well, just to explain the tools, we have a couple of them. Obviously the move tool, it goes without saying, but a couple of options up here. We have the image, and I would say predominantly a lot of options in the image. Edit is a very good one as well, and you'll find that major file changes are done in the edit box, such as purge, transform, and that's about it. Anyway, not a whole lot, but clearly some of the key commands like copy, paste, cut, all those things are of course in edit, undo, redo, those kinds of things. Another one that's really good is actually changing the size of this piece of paper. You'll notice by default, I've got the ruler at the top, and if you don't have the ruler at the top, you can do Control R or Command R if you're on the Mac, and of course bring it into view, right? Of course, Control or Command R, as in, what's the military abbreviation for R? Anybody know? Is it Roger? Romeo. Thank you. Yeah, R is in Romeo. But in our case, we can go to image, and you'll notice that there's an image size and a canvas size. Those do two different things. Canvas size is essentially, well, like the canvas. An image, kind of like the canvas, but not quite. Let's click on each one. In my case, the image size, oh, that seems familiar. 11 by 17, great, wonderful. That's the way I started the project. And 300 DPI or 350 DPI. That actually is that pixelation, and it stands for essentially the amount of pixels per inch. In my case, I have a 350 by 350 box that holds 350 pixels per inch. That's pretty good. However, does anybody know what you should use for your hand sketches? 450. Definitely get some really nice crisp drawings, and that way I can make them a little bit bigger and they won't get pixelated, and I can even make them smaller and make them that much better. However, in my case, you'll notice that even if I increase this to, like, say 450 and I zoom in, it really is relatively the same, because it's going to keep what I first brought in there. Arguably, if I just keep increasing the DPI, it's going to get worse and worse, even though intuitively it should be getting better and better, right? So don't get me wrong, I can try again, and let's take a look. So in my case, I'm going to keep that one just to kind of show you the difference. But again, I think it's important to note what we're doing when we actually drag things, or when we're actually doing some of these steps. So for instance, let's try it again and bring that in. Make sure you actually click on a line. Selecting something in Illustrator is just painfully awful. Oh, already recognizes it. Maybe I can make a copy. It doesn't want me to drag one in because it thinks I've already got one. Let's cheat the system. Hold shift and it'll let you. Good job. All right. It doesn't want you to overdo your work. But let's take a look at those lines now. Ooh, arguably a little bit more crisp, right? Not by much. We only increased the DPI by, like, what, 100, right? Don't get me wrong, like a billboard, the DPI of that thing is like 5,000, right? It is insane. Why? Because, well, they're paying top dollar so that you can read this board from arguably like a mile away. And you ain't gonna do that if it's real blurry, right? So you can imagine that the Photoshop files that they have for those billboards are extreme, right? I mean, 5,000 DPI, most computers can't even handle that. Arguably, these probably could, but my laptop would probably not. However, I just want you to notice, you know, we can use Photoshop for the rasterized, incredible tool that it is, but to be aware of how those things work. The next thing that we can go over is, of course, canvas size, and we can go ahead and flip this around because I wanted landscape. So in my case, as you can imagine, this changes the size of the paper, right? Literally the paper, as in, this piece. Keep in mind, it doesn't really control the DPI, so it's not really controlling the rasterized parts. However, if I change it to 11, you'll see that it actually recrops the whole thing. So again, be careful. I mean, is it canvas size I want, or is it image size that I want? In my case, I'm gonna have to decompose that one. This is, of course, what keeps it proportional. Usually you find these little locks, or what is called a link. And like I said, I record these because there's a lot of terms and things that we go over. But image size looks like it's gonna help us out a little bit more, right? Obviously, it didn't want me to change that paper, right? It's not just gonna rotate it like Illustrator would, or honestly any other program. Why they put them next to each other in Photoshop, I'll never know, but maybe just to confuse everybody. However, from here, we can really start having some fun and starting to dissect this thing and use it, right? So, I mean, one of the best tools of all time, and let's just go ahead and minimize that because that's gonna kind of visually get in the way. And let's maybe up that a little bit, there we go. Let's start filling this in with something, right? Obviously, a major component of any elevation or perspective is probably some sort of sky attribute or in the background. I don't know about you, but do you guys know who Bob Ross is?
Yeah.
He's the painter, right? From the 70s, big afro, great guy, right? Said there was no mistakes, but only happy accidents, and I'm definitely a firm believer in that. But I will say, it's up to you whether you want to start in the foreground and work your way back. Most art, and even myself included, I start in the background and move to the foreground. Why? Because if I mess up, I can always cover it with something. No, I'm just kidding. We can't even mess up in Photoshop. There's an undo button. Can't even mess up in the digital realm, really, unless you don't save and the power goes out. That does happen, by the way. Anyway, not too often, thankfully. But in our case, maybe let's focus on the sky first. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the plus sign on the layer box and double click on it and call it the sky layer. Sweet. I can click on this layer in order to enact it. Now that's really important because honestly, if you don't have any layer enacted, Photoshop's like, what do you want to do? I don't even know, bud. You got to give it some direction. And in my case, this direction would be telling which layer what it is I want it to do. So for instance, maybe that vector smart object, well, let's call it our base lines because that's what it is. And if I don't want it to move, let's lock it so I don't accidentally change it or erase it. You'll notice if I hit E for eraser, it doesn't even want me to do it because it's like, bro, you got it locked. You can't do anything. And that can kind of save you some time and from accidentally erasing something you don't want to. So again, just trying to hit the basics here. I know it's a little improv, I do apologize, but I'm making the best of it. However, if we do want to use it, you'll notice it does need to be unlocked, right? Whether you want to use the magic wand tool or a lasso tool. So one of my favorite tools is the polygonal lasso tool, which, don't get me wrong, selection's cool, but it only does so much. It only makes rectangles, and nobody's got that kind of time, right? Just trying to find every rectangle that we possibly can. However, to deselect something, because I just selected, and you may actually see these like tiny little ants running around. You guys see that? They're known as the tiny ants. I get it, but also like it's a little childish if you ask me. But in my case, let it continue. But we can do it that way, but as you can see, it's kind of outside the lines, if you will, right? So in order to deselect something, I can do Control D as in dog or delta, or Command D if you're in the Mac, right? Control and Command, they're really the same key per Mac and Windows, just in case you didn't know. I can hold spacebar and use pan. That is a game changer, by the way. I wish somebody would have told me that years ago. I was sitting there going like this and trying to scroll, and yeah, hold spacebar and you can move around, right? Definitely, and you can do that in Illustrator too, right? I'm not sure if anyone told you, but again, like I said, the stuff you learn along the way, right? Hold spacebar, and of course you can click and pan. In my case, the next tool that we can go over is the lasso tool, like I was saying, and you can actually pinpoint these things. Like I said, keep in mind which layer you're working on. I don't want to accidentally erase my layer. In fact, I want to get a sky layer, so let's go ahead and trace the sky. That should be pretty easy for this perspective. After all, I just need to get the top portion and arguably maybe trace a little bit here. So let's go ahead and do so. I'm going to start right there, click, make sure that I'm on the sky layer. I can hold shift and make sure that it's a straight line. I can do it at a 45, 0, -45, but let's keep it straight for today. I can get fancy with the spices and be like, psh, psh, psh. Those are my clouds for today. But in my case, this is where it'll really come in handy, because everybody knows in architecture we predominantly work with a lot of straight lines. And you'll see that the way that I'm tracing this is actually in the midpoint of the line. Keep in mind, it's not adding to the layer, it's not actually affecting anything yet. And in my case, I'm really just tracing the extents of where I'd want the sky to be. In my case, obviously I don't want the sky inside the project, unless these are actually handrails. Time will tell, but in my case, I can hold shift along the way, and yes, it can be a little tedious depending on the amount of geometry or the amount of lines that you have. But you'll notice that I'm clicking inside the line because, well, eventually I'm going to have the lines on top, and they'll cover any sort of discrepancies, well, as long as my line tracing is in the middle of the line. Obviously the middle hiding sometimes the imperfections of our tracings, to say the least. But in my case, I'm going to take some time, and on those straight verticals, I'm just going to hold shift and do my best to trace this up. I know it is for the sake of tutorial, so I should probably go a little bit faster and fake it till I make it. You'll notice when you're about to close the line, however, that it turns into kind of this little O shape, right? Indicating that actually it's about to close. Do you want to do that? Obviously, when you click there, it will close it. Another thing to be said is if I double click anywhere, it will also automatically close it. So for instance, if I double click, ooh, it's gonna keep that last click. Can I edit undo? No, in fact, I can't edit undo. I'd have to trace that all over again unless I listen to this tutorial. In my case, you'll notice if I hold shift, you see a plus sign. I can add to my selection. If I hold the control or option key, you'll see a minus sign. So that should tell you, if I want to nix some of the things that I've selected, if I hold the minus sign, or in my case option, or alt on Windows, if I hold that and I do another trace, it's going to get rid of that part of the selection, right? Just want to throw it out there because, again, these are the tips and tricks that eventually help you complete the project before anybody else in class, right? In my case, I want to go with a nice soft sky, so I'm going to go with a brush, or the letter B as in boy, or beta. And basically you'll see it turn into a brush. Another way to find it is, of course, right here. And you'll notice, especially in Photoshop, if you right click on some of these tools, they actually have multiple tools inside them. You'll find that the pencil tool, the brush tool, the color replacement tool, which I've never used, don't ask me. Obviously you'll see them all in the same category. So if we go to the brush tool and we right click, you'll see that there is tons of options. In fact, there's some that are free, and well, if you're in my class, I let you just download bunches of brushes. Don't worry. Tunks has got even better collections that I hope that he's already sharing with you. In fact, that is some high dollar material, by the way. Keep it forever. He's kept it forever, and he's had his computer stolen multiple times, and he still has it. It is literally priceless. It's the work that he did in watercolor when he was originally at SAC, and he still puts them in his elevation, at least as the legend goes. So one thing that could be said is the stuff that you're doing right now could literally help you 15 years from now, and that's pretty big. Anyway, in our case, if you right click on that brush tool, you'll get a lot of different options, and if we're on the Wacom, you'll actually see the pen when it moves, it actually changes some of these options, and it does get pretty cool. But nevertheless, I do have some pens and some brushes. To be fair, everybody has Adobe and has the full access to Adobe, right? If you go and just type in Adobe Photoshop brushes for free, there's thousands of them. You can load them on your own computer, and I'm not going to go over that necessarily today. Literally, it's a drag and drop situation. It's wonderful. Another way to do it is, of course, go to this little cogwheel and load them up yourself. So again, just a word to the wise. But yeah, I have my Studio Ghibli set and my Digi Sketch, and of course all these wonderful unique tools that I use to, again, simulate what I would normally do in a drafting table. Honestly, I have a Wacom tablet at home, and I no longer draw or draft in a sketchbook. I do it entirely digitally. But I couldn't do that without actually my analog training. In my case, let's go with a simple brush, maybe something that you guys actually even have. So let's go with like a dry media brush and just call it a day. In my case, you'll see that we can control the size and not the hardness. Not every single tool is the same, and you'll see in some tools you can change the hardness versus other tools you can't, right? The hardness indicating literally what it means, the hardness of the brush or how hard I'm actually using it sensitive-wise, right? Especially if you're on the Wacom. Actually, this is always grayed out on the Wacom because it goes based on your depth. If you press it harder, it bleeds more. If you press it lightly, it just lightly touches it. So anyway, let's get a brush tool in there, and I don't know about you, but let's not have black skies. Let's have some nice Bob Ross, lightly colored. I'm gonna go big or go home because I mean, who wants to be here all day making skies? So I'm gonna go with something a little big. Brush it in. Done. That's it. Now, don't get me wrong, I make it look easy. But as you can see, I was kind of going the same direction as a diagonal. Let's see actually another way we can make the sky. Go real big. All right, and in my case, I'm going to go with some floating clouds. Very ethereal clouds. So not very defined, maybe just kind of a nice bright day. Of course, the more that I add, the more color that is applied, right, in our case. And what's nice about this is I did that to my selection. You'll notice I could click anywhere. It didn't go outside of that selected line. Now, if I deselected, so Command D, and I do that again, right, obviously not what I wanted, and definitely not going to be the sky that I want. However, once I've done that to this layer, I have it forever. Well, what if I want a red sky? I mean, don't get me wrong, let's just paint the color red. But, well, do I need to do that tracing again? Absolutely not. Let's talk about our next tool, which is the Magic Wand tool. You'll notice by default, it's actually set to usually a quick selection tool or an object selection tool. To be honest, again, some of these, I truly don't know how to use them because I've never had to. But Magic Wand tool is definitely a good one, and quick selection tool is actually fairly new. But what's nice is I can click and bam, I got that wonderful selection back because it's actually reading the color space that I just actually colored. In fact, if I turn these two off, you'll see that immediately, yeah, that's actually what it's implied. Another thing to keep in mind though is, well, if I'm on this layer and I select, it didn't get the sky. Why? Well, because it was on my baseline layer. So now it's using the Magic Wand tool to understand where my layers are for those lines. However, if I have some open lines, yeah, it bleeds right through. If my lines are closed, it keeps it closed, right, to say the very least. But now that we got a sky, another thing that we can do is, of course, change the opacity of that layer. And we can really make it just super nice. Next thing that we can do is, well, add something, maybe some texture, maybe, oh, sorry, James, what do you got?
Like, say you add something to a layer you don't want it on and you want it to put on something else, is there a way to like drag and drop with the box tool on Photoshop?
Help me understand that correctly.
Like, let's say you wanted to put like a box or a rectangle or something like on the baselines file, but you accidentally put it on the sky layer, would you have to like just redo it?
Gotcha. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Like you're saying, like, can I transfer it over to another layer?
Yeah.
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, it is one of those things that be very careful, and I do try to make note of it. Like, make sure you're clicking on the layer you want to click on. Very often, a lot of students, they do everything in one layer, and it's like, oh crap. Because then professor comes back and goes, well, can you actually change the sky up, or can you give us a different view? And you're like, well, there goes all that work. When I could have just actually saved my layers, right? Individually, I can turn off that layer and try again. Turn off that layer, try again. Or manipulate that layer. It's definitely a good question. The question was, if I accidentally draw something in here, can I basically transfer it to another one? That's actually a good, I could technically, I guess, duplicate that layer, get rid of the initial one, and manipulate that. I mean, that's kind of how I'd get around it. Short answer is definitely no. Right? Like, kind of once you make the mistake, or it's one of those things like just undo if you did make a mistake.
What would be your best option
Right.
So you,
Obviously, be cognizant if you're messing up or not. Yeah.
so you kind of like drag and drop just like Illustrator, how you would like you get the box and you select it and then you drag it to the other layer. You have to do like you said.
Right. However, the thing that is, I mean, don't get me wrong, they do work very, very closely. They come from the same program. But again, one is a vector program and one is a raster program. Some things are easier in this program that are arguably impossible in Illustrator, and vice versa, right? So again, it's kind of using it the way that best fits the objective. But in my case, as I was mentioning, we can add trees, texture layers, all kinds of things, and arguably easier than I would say Illustrator. So in my case, let's maybe get a brick texture or something, and in most cases I like to use Google Images for my textures, or Pinterest. Pinterest is actually pretty good too. But in my case, maybe I want a brick texture, maybe I want a concrete texture. Yeah, I could go for some concrete texture. However, the keyword there is if I type in just concrete, you get a kind of a lot there, and arguably on the worst internet in the world, that's not exactly the texture you want to take from. That's more of an action going on. It's like a verb instead of what we want is an adjective here. It's something that's more like that. However, something that helps is actually material or texture. Sometimes even both, right? Because I definitely get a little bit better results in that case. Another thing that could be said is, well, if you get, let's look for one with a watermark, right? Can you get rid of watermarks in 2025? Does anybody know how? AI. It's like the only real great use for it. Otherwise, Firefly and Adobe AI can be kind of a hit and miss situation. You got to be very particular. But in our case, let's say this was the magical piece that, I'm really digging its texture, and I really want to add this potentially to one of the walls or many of the walls. One thing that I could do if I have to pay for it is take a screenshot. And you'll notice that there's some stuff in the image, so I do want to take that one. Another thing that could be said is, well, you could right click and go and open the image in a new tab. And that's the one that I would save. However, keep in mind, in this case, it does look like a paid image, and they're just giving us a little thumbnail. Not really the greatest quality, and we can't really work with that a whole lot. So, let's maybe take the bigger image, or I can even zoom in and get my mouse out of the way. There we go. And I do want to show you how to remove a watermark, but in my case, a screenshot is fine too. I can directly just drag that right into it, and it's going to treat it as a new image. It's also going to automatically go into a transform mode. What do I mean by that? Well, when you click on something, it can go into a transform mode, which is kind of starting to show these like bounding boxes, if you will. You'll notice that you're able to change its proportion, you're able to shrink it, stretch it. If you hold shift, you can actually manipulate the proportions of it, so on and so forth, right? But essentially from here, I might want to do a couple things to it. In my case, it's going to get much smaller and possibly become the facade of this wall, right? However, I'm going to kind of keep it off to the side for now because I might need to, don't get me wrong, there's two ways, there's more than two ways, or even more than one. In my case, the first way that I could do is actually just stretch this image to its location. So for instance, maybe I keep this piece here, and in order to see it a little bit better against my lines, I'll do something like that real quick. But I'm going to hold Option or Alt, right? Oops. Make sure you get it. There we go. And I can quite literally just change its perspective. You'll notice that it even remarkably kind of sticks true. Now, I would say this is not only the quickest way, but probably the most inaccurate too, right? It's not exactly going to follow the exact texture. Things are going to look a little stretched. However, at this scale, might not be too shabby, right? So, don't get me wrong. I know some of us are always pressed for time in studio. And again, sometimes you got to choose option 1 because you only have 30 seconds. And if you have 2 hours, you can choose option 2. So, don't get me wrong, we can manipulate these things, and wildly, by the way. You can really get a perspective on that guy. And it's going to more or less change and manipulate the texture pretty well. If I hit enter, of course, it's going to keep that a little bit more stationary. And as soon as I click on another layer, it's going to kind of lock that into place. Now, if I'm in the move tool, this is kind of nice. It's not not in the old versions of Photoshop. But now you can hover against an item and it actually starts to highlight it. That's honestly kind of a plus. Back in the day, kind of a wild, wild west of selecting something. Unfortunately, I wish Illustrator would get on board. But in our case, there is another way, so I'm going to just put that back up here real quick and go over the second way. So in my case, at least, I would say the true and architectural way, because in architecture, we definitely like to show true scale or true proportion or true colors or definitely realistic situations, especially when we're showing the final money shot is often what we call it. So in our case, you know, maybe I actually want to select this first and maybe dial it in exactly to what's happening in the architecture. For instance, maybe during studio I realize, oh man, you know, I just want actually the skirt for this. I don't necessarily need the whole piece, or, you know, actually I need to go around this door, or, you know, actually maybe I just want that piece. What do I do? Well, I can put it in there and of course just chop it right off. So in my case, it's going to leave that selection. That selection is not really bound to anything. What's kind of nice is that selection is now on this layer. That selection is now on this layer. That selection is now on this layer. So what's kind of nice about that is now I can take this guy, move him across. Now keep in mind, as soon as you move, however, it will move that selection, right? So I may want to either drag it in again. I could do that. Actually, I don't know if I can. I think the Mac, actually, when you drag it in from the screenshot, it doesn't save it, but that's because I did that on purpose. So I didn't have all these screenshot files. I take a lot of screenshots per day. So let's do that again and drag that right back in now. Again, really the same image. Obviously, you'd want to select your image and put it in the right spot before you move stuff around. But let's say I kind of want that dark texture at the bottom, and I kind of want that lightness at the top because, well, it's starting to express maybe the lighting conditions of the perspective that I'm using. Or maybe I really need to actually change the scale of this texture and I need to tile it in some way. And that would be okay too. In my case, I could enter, copy and paste, right? And make actually quite a few of them, right? I can start to put them together or start to mix and match them, especially if this was like the right scale. Don't get me wrong, I think it's still way too big. In fact, it's probably more or less something actually that small. And of course, once you hit enter in the transform mode, it does more or less change, right? It kind of gives you a preview. But again, enter, and we kind of get, again, kind of an interesting piece. And as you can see, I'm stacking up on my screenshot, but that's okay. I'm gonna really relatively more or less kind of fake it till I make it. I kind of want it uneven. I kind of want it a little out of scaled. After all, perfection is imperfection, at least in one person's opinion. In fact, I usually give the example of Toy Story 4. The reason why Toy Story 4 is so much better than Toy Story 1 is not just because they use better computers, but in fact, Toy Story 1 was far too perfect. Look at the geometry. Look at Andy's birthday party. They're actually all the same kid, but different colors. They didn't even try to add detail. They were hoping that they could trick the mind in split seconds, where they couldn't necessarily do that in Toy Story 4, so they added the dirt, they added the scuff marks, they added the dents to the toys, and guess what? That made it look more real. How does making something look dirtier make it look real? Well, life is dirty, right? You have to understand what is going on in life to, of course, Photoshop things realistically. I would say as many clicks as you can learn on the Photoshop magic box, it doesn't do you any good if you don't know what reality looks like. So go look at it. In fact, I learned this aspect when I was in my painting class at San Antonio College. I was trying to paint a space sky, a night sky, and I was painting it black. My teacher comes over and she goes, "Have you ever seen the sky black?" And I was like, "Yeah, the sky's black." And she goes, it was a night class. She goes, "Let's go outside." And we went outside and I was like, "It's black." And she goes, "Look again." I was like, "It's actually a dark, 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 dark purple. It's actually really rich." And if I stared at it a little bit longer, the lights got a little bit brighter, and I started to understand that my preconceived notion of what I thought looked good and like reality was in fact not. I needed to go outside and really look at what I was looking at. So one thing I would say is if you notice that your Photoshop skills seem under par, it still doesn't look realistic, or it still doesn't look the way that you want it, take a step back like an artist would. Look at it from afar. Go outside. Look at nature. It's the best example of what we're actually trying to apply for. However, bear with me. I got about 15 more minutes and I'll let you guys out of here. Or stick around. You can totally answer questions if you got them. But in my case, let's get a little bit of texture in there. And like I said, kind of improving it as well. But in my case, let's say I was going for something very realistic. I kind of want that skirt and, you know, need some more information there. I also don't want it to look tiled, so I'll show you what I do for that as well. But I'm going to kind of stretch it out, Toy Story for it. I mean, why not? I'm also going to take every single one of these layers, and since they are all the same, and I can, of course, double check that. Yep, definitely the same. I'm going to right click and merge visible. Be careful, don't flatten the image. It'll flatten the entire image and turn it into one layer. In my case, I'm going to merge these visible layers into one layer. Now in my case, I think I accidentally messed up and had too many layers. So let's take those again. I held shift on that one so that I can get all of them from bit to bit, just like a file loader. And, oh sorry, I put merge visible, merge layers. Wonderful. So that'll turn basically into a concrete texture layer. And that's fair enough for today. And of course you can verify that as well. In my case, I hate super saturated imagery, and often, again, I worked really hard on that line work both in Rhino and in Illustrator now. So why would I constantly hide it? No, let's make these actually work together, right? And of course, Professor Tunks will say this in his own 2 words. I'm a little bit more flamboyant about it, but just really to give emphasis to the video and keep you guys awake for today, right? But let's say, obviously, I can use my selection tool. And let's say maybe that was the final selection. I'm gonna hold shift, make sure that's straight, and voila. From here, I can do a couple things, but you may notice if I hit E as in eraser, right? Obviously, I don't want to erase from my baselines. So make sure that you're just erasing from one piece. You'll notice if I start erasing, it's like, oh man, that's the piece I wanted to keep, right? I need to get the outside piece. So in my case, I'll go back to my selection tool, right click, and select the inverse or the opposite of what I just selected. So I selected kind of this piece. If I select inverse, it's going to get the outside piece, right? Select the inverse, looks the exact same. It's kind of tricky. I'll hit E as an elephant or echo and erase. And now I can go like this, and I don't have to spend a whole lot of time making sure that I get everything correct, right? What if my professor comes back and goes, no, I wanted side pieces of wood. How dare you use concrete? Okay. Well, I'm going to take that magic wand tool. I'm going to make sure it's on the right layer. Click, and got that selected again. Change it to wood. Erase it. Now, I mean, I know it's your first day in Photoshop, and I've already gone over quite a few things. One of the first major things is, of course, putting stuff in or brushing stuff in. And really a mix in between those, as I think, is actually pretty safe. Hopefully, of course, this is a nice startup. Obviously, just to recap, we took some lines in from Illustrator. Awesome. You can also import, right? So I don't want to skip over too much, but if you go to place embedded or place linked, keep in mind linked means if I delete the file, it deletes from Photoshop because it's linked to the file. If I place embedded, it puts it in there, but keep in mind if it's 2.3 gigs, it's going to make this Photoshop file now 2.3 gigs heavier. That's not always what you want. So again, kind of up to you, but essentially they do the same thing. But you'll notice if you go to place embedded, there's actually a lot of different files we can put in here. You'll notice that none of them are an Adobe Illustrator file or a DWG. So keep in mind, not all these programs work so delicately together. Arguably, the reason why I've kind of shared with you the history. They're not made by the same people. And so when these get purchased and bought, they go, hey, make this work with the other program. They go, I'll make it look the same, you know, and they think that's like gonna help us. Trust me, there's thousands of forums on Reddit of people complaining every day. But regardless, we also went over how to manage the sky, how to change canvas or image size, how to put a sky in there, get some layers, change some line work in Illustrator, and of course bring it in, a little bit of texture, a little bit of transformation, And honestly, I would say that's probably just enough to get started, right? Now, I know this is more in a vacuum. I don't know where he's going to take this per se. I would imagine it's perspective. But just in case you need to find where to go and where you'd find this video, we'll go to YouTube for today. And if you type in Crabapple Designs or Chris Verrett on the world's slowest internet, wow, does it just get worse throughout the day or what? Fair enough. Today, Junior. Sweet. Yeah, you can definitely type in Crabapple Designs or Chris V Peace, as in World Peace. You can totally watch a SAC architecture PR video that I made years ago, or you can see that I do keep track of each and every single tutorial. So even if I didn't cover it today, or you have other Photoshop questions, again, I always ask, of course, Professor Tunks. But keep in mind, I do show how to use the laser cutter, a lot of different computer graphic stuff that now should be at least applicable to you, right? So don't get me wrong, we all teach this a little bit differently. If you don't get it my way, that's okay. Try it Tunks way. If you don't get it Tunks way, try it Longoria way. If you don't like it Longoria's way, try it Verrett's way. And what I will say is we all learned a little bit differently, and we all learned this program, the same program, from a lot of different places. So keep that in mind, that there's not really a right or wrong way. There's just a long way and a short way, right? But that being said, I will upload this video. That way you guys can have it. I'll basically call it Trent's substitute class, just in case you want to take a look. And arguably there is playlists of all the archive videos since 2020, and I do label them like Illustrator, Photoshop, Rhino. So if you type in Rhino, you get a bunch of Rhino. If you type in Photoshop, there's not a whole lot of Photoshop on there, but there is some. Arguably what we did and covered today, and definitely a few more advanced things. If you're trying to put in some trees, scale figures, or really dive into, I mean, you can make some stuff look really, really good in Photoshop. But again, this is just step one. So before I end it, is there any major questions about what we went over today, or maybe a random question? You want me to cover it? You want to see how it's done? Please. That way we can get it recorded and you can keep it forever. Anything? Fair enough? Going once, twice? I do have a joke for you though. Why did Snoop Dogg bring an umbrella?
To protect his blunt.
No, but that was a good guess. Anybody? For drizzle. Anyway, we'll leave it on a good note.